Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're working on another Klipsch speaker. Can you believe it? People just keep sending in these Klipsch speakers. So this one is the model RP504C version 2. And the reason there's a version 2 is because they're correcting problems in the original models. And there was problems with almost the whole product line in that the way they designed the crossover for these originally, the drivers never summed properly. In other words, they were out of phase at the crossover point. There was a phase rotation of 80 to 90 degrees, and so one rolled into the other, and they never summed. Just the frequency response followed that. And it was as if they just did that through the whole product line. They were just calculating a crossover, and they weren't really measuring it to see what the effects were, I guess. And so we were designing new filters to fix that problem, among many others. And a lot of the diehard Klipsch fans were a little upset, saying that we're destroying that house sound, that's the way they intended it to sound. That's the way they wanted it. And I can assure you, no one designs a speaker and decides, you know what, that smooth response looks good, but I would imagine if I took the crossover and I caused a phase shift to where they don't sum and there's a big hole in the response, I bet that would be better. No one does that ever. Also, with a lot of these drivers, there is a lot of ringing and breakup up at the higher frequency ranges, and even in the lower range of this tweeter, there's some ringing. And no one goes about speaker design and says, well, spectral decay looks real clean, but it sure would sound good if at 2 kHz we had a bunch of ringing right there. No one does that ever. So I'm not ruining a house sound when I go in and I design a filter that corrects some of those things and balances the frequency response. Not just about the frequency response. It's about a whole group of things that make up what we hear when we hear music played back through the speakers. So what Klipsch did was they've gone through and they've redesigned those products within that product line. They've designed new crossovers to fix the out of phase problems. And we're gonna look at that and what they did. But first, let's look at the speaker in general, and let's dig into it a little bit and evaluate what's here. Then I want to compare it to what they had originally. Let's look at the version 1 measurements and then the version 2 and how they've made some corrections, and then where they still left a lot on the table, and there's still a lot left on the table. So I went in and did some further design work and corrected a lot of other things and made it to where it's going to be a pretty decent sounding center channel speaker if you're sitting right in front of it. And I say that because when you get a speaker that's this big, and as you can see, it's pretty wide, and the drivers are spread out across a pretty big area here. So as you move left or right, the off-axis position that you're in causes drivers on one side to be closer to you than drivers on the other. So you're creating a time shift. And when you do that, it becomes an out-of-phase situation, and it causes big holes in the response. And a speaker designed like this is good on axis and to about 10 degrees off axis. And as you get further than 10 degrees off axis, it becomes a disaster. So we'll look at that as well. But driver complement and everything looks similar to the original. Same drivers. This was a little harder to get off for some reason. These little bead rings, to take these off, you have to go around the inside of the driver and you have to pop these out. They're just popped on. And then it exposes the screws that you can remove. Same with the tweeter. It's kind of clever the way they put this thing on there. And if you look at all the little pins that these things sit in, this thing just fits down over it. And this rubbery wave guide, as you'd call, I guess you call it, is technically for them they want to call it a horn. It's kind of more of a wave guide. Just peels off, and then once you peel it off, it exposes all the screws, and you can take the tweeter off. You can also then reach in and unscrew the screws that hold in the crossover, take the binding posts apart, go ahead and disassemble all of it. you're going to need to disassemble everything in order to implement the upgrade. Now let's look at this new crossover. If you take a look at it here, what we see is we see some iron core inductors there on the woofer circuit that are turned in the exact same direction. And you see some electrolytic capacitors. And then all these little inductors are corrective circuits there in the tweeter. And they're all turned in the same direction. So we're kind of missing the ABCs here in speaker design. When you design a speaker, you never want the inductors all facing the same direction, because then the magnetic fields interact from one to the other and it causes a disruption, and they really didn't follow those basic principles. The binding posts that they put on here look cooler. They do. They've got little anodized aluminum cups on them, and you think, wow, they really updated the binding posts. Those got to be better. But if you flip it over on the other side, you'll see that the terminals are steel that these things are connected to, and the nuts on the back side are also steel. So it's the worst kind of material you can have in the signal path, is to put a bunch of ferrous material in there. And that's exactly what they did with these. Good thing is you can take these nuts off, you can unscrew these, you can drill these holes out a little bit, and you can insert tube connectors right in there and have a pure copper tube there that'll improve the signal transfer by a lot. So insulation inside, they very lightly put in some material on the bottom, side, and top, just around the woofers. They actually need a lot more insulation than that. I would definitely fill the back half of the box. Of course, it's also going to help when you line it with no-res and this very hollow, resonant sounding box. I'm sorry, this is on the table that the microphone's on, so I probably gave you guys a little thump on the other end. Sorry about that, guys. I'm going to work on trying to get this set up on something new that holds it so that it's not on the table. But for right today, it's on the table. So no-res is going to really help the resonance of the boxes, and then lining it with some insulation. That's going to really help a lot. But let's go right to the measurements on this thing, and let's look at these, first of all, compared to the original version. Let's do this. Let's get the frequency response of the original version up here, and then the frequency response of the new version here, the version 2. And as you can see, the version 2 is much smoother. Also, if you look at the original, that you can tell the tweeter is really hot on those things. I mean, it's playing a lot louder than it needs to play compared to the newer one. The newer one, the tweeter level is brought down, so it's not near as offensive, but it's still louder than the woofers. And there's still a little bit of a hole there at the crossover point. It's not an out of phase problem like it was with the original, which there's a huge hole there. That's because the drivers weren't in phase. This one is just the woofer level is not brought up and rolled off in a way that they both roll into each other well. There's a bit of a gap there, and it causes a bit of a dip. Let's look at, let's go right to the horizontal off axis. Let's look at the original horizontal off axis on the first version, and let's look at the horizontal off axis on this version, and they're both pretty bad. Let's face it, when you move left or right, it's going to create a out of phase situation with these outer drivers, and it's going to disrupt the response. If you look at the red line and the orange line, those are on axis and at 10 degrees off axis, and they're not that bad. But as you get further than that, you get 20, 30, and 40 degrees off axis. Show's over by then, folks. This thing has got too much cancellation going on. It really can't be used if you're setting that far off axis. Let's look at the original. You look at the spectral decay, you'll notice there was some stored energy there in the tweeter's lower range, and likewise with this one to a different degree, there's a little stored energy there as well. So we got a little bit of ringing going on right there. Impedance-wise, they're not that different from the original to the version 2. Just issues in the off-axis response and issues there in the spectral decay. If we look at the vertical off-axis, it stays pretty consistent. That means as you move up or down, you're not changing the time arrival of anything. You're just changing the off-axis response, basically the tweeter, and it drops off pretty evenly. So, and when I set this thing up, what I tried was several different things. I wanted to just cross the two center woofers to the tweeter, which is something they've got a little different circuit on the center two versus the outer two. I tried to take that a little further, and I put a really large inductor on the outer two and try to make it just do bass only, and looked at the horizontal off-axis, and it was still bad. It just wasn't, there just wasn't any getting around it. The acoustic centers of these woofers to the tweeter is still pretty far. And so even just crossing to these drivers, because this is so large and spaces everything so far apart, as you move left or right, it just fell apart. So I started over with what I was doing with it. I went ahead and let the outer woofers play up a little higher, and it's still a different filter on the lower ones, or the inner ones versus the outer ones, but I brought them up to where the sensitivity is still up there pretty good. It's about 94 dB sensitivity. I don't know what they call this originally. I didn't look to see what the actual sensitivity was, but on average, it's about 94. It's still on average about 94, but I brought the tweeter level down to where it's balanced, to where it matches the woofer level. So let's look at the frequency response before and after, so you can see where it was and then what I did with it. And you can tell it's a lot smoother. A lot of those areas there where that brightness is, usually around 2 to 3 kHz, and there was a little bit of a peak there at 3 kHz and above. That's going to be an area of brightness. I've flattened that out to where it's much smoother. If you look at the vertical off-axis before and after, both of those are still rolling off about the same, other than now it's balanced, so you got a nice balanced response. And if you look at the horizontal off-axis, it is still about the same. It's still not great, but better than it was. And here's a biggie here. If you look at the spectral decay, you'll see that there was some ringing at 2 kHz in the tweeter's response. I pulled that back out of the tweeter a little bit and got that out of it. So the spectral decay is much cleaner. And I'll throw up also the response of the individual drivers so you can see what they look like. The green line, or the lower one there, is the outer woofers. Then you got the upper woofers, and then you got the tweeter rolling into it. So it created a nice smooth response. So I put together a little upgrade package for these things. It includes all new crossover parts, and that's big 16-gauge air core inductors from US Coils. And there is one on each of the woofers, and there's one on the tweeter circuit. We got a pair of sonic caps in the tweeter circuit also, and that's going to bring a lot of clarity and detail to the upper frequency ranges. And we're using the JB polycaps on the lower woofers. We've got the smaller one there on the inner and the larger one there on the outer one, so it's not playing up as high. And then we've got the new Dayton copper resistors. And all in all, the crossover parts totaled 9 parts. In the original, I think it was 14 parts in the original. Let me see real quick. Yeah, 14 parts in the original crossover. So the parts count went down, quality went way up, and we've got a set of tube connectors that are going to replace these cheesy parts. We've got all new wiring and a sheet of no-res to control some of this cabinet resonance. So it should take this from a point where it's harsh and hard to listen to a point where it's fairly smooth, where it's balanced, and you have resolution that it never had before. And, keep in mind when we do these upgrades on pretty much everything, a lot of these speakers are all built at price points. They can't afford to put this level of parts in there and capacitors like this into it from the factory, because it would increase the cost significantly. It'd be a $2,000 speaker instead of whatever they sell it for. The only way to keep those costs down is to put really cheesy parts in there. But you'd think they would at least know how to orient the parts so that they're not affecting one another. And there are inexpensive parts that can be used that are still a lot better than what's on here. So, like I've said before, they're built to a price point. and there's only so much that they can do at a certain price point. When you see a product that's, let's say, $1,000, it has to be built for about 1/5 of that price. So they had $200 to build everything if it retailed for $1,000. It's the same with this. You can take it and divide it by 4 or divide it by 5, and that's what they had to work with in order to build the whole thing. So it is what it is. So we have an advantage in being able to just offer the parts upgrades, and you guys install it yourself, and you wind up getting a whole lot better speaker. Now, total on all this, $319 for all the new parts, tube connectors, wiring, solder, heat shrink, sheet and O-res, everything you need. $319. You get it all drawn out in a little schematic to where you can follow it easily. You get our support. We'll help you through it if you need help. We'll walk you through any aspect of it if you need us to. And that does it for this one. All you Klipsch guys out there, there is hope for you guys. You can turn these things into something, and I hope you appreciate the work we do on this stuff. I know a lot of you do. We sell more Klipsch upgrades by far than all the other speaker upgrades that we've done. There's a lot of these out there, and a lot of you guys are taking these and you're moving yourself into that DIY section of the market a little bit. You're getting into the do-it-yourself stuff. You're getting your feet wet, fixing some of these, and then a lot of you come back to us and order some of our kits, and we really do appreciate that. Also appreciate all you guys who subscribe and watch our videos each week. That's it for this one, and hopefully you'll see me again in the next one.